Welcome to this webinar on finding underlying and unstated issues. Throughout this video, you will see a paper pencil icon on some slides indicating a workbook activity. When you see this icon on the top left corner, this means I'll be asking you to write something in your workbook or refer to your workbook. If possible, download the workbook from the Career Compass Resource Center or CCRC before continuing with this course. However, if you are not able to, no worries. Just use any piece of paper and write your thoughts down on that. You can always transfer that to the workbook later. Today, you will learn how to determine underlying causes of conflict in the workplace. You'll learn how to judge whether the conflict is positive or negative, and you'll assess your conflict management style and learn about others. Just so you know what to expect from this video, here's a summary of our agenda. We'll go through an introduction where we'll talk about different types of conflict. We'll talk about how to find underlying issues that can cause conflict. And then we'll talk about how to know your own conflict resolution style and when to use what style. First off, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on something. Can you think of an example of a conflict that you've been involved in the workplace? This could be between you and another coworker, or maybe you had to get involved when people you supervise were in conflict with each other. I just want you to think back to that situation for a moment. Think about when that conflict first came onto your radar and at what point, if any, you took action to resolve it. What did you do? And were you satisfied with the outcome? Please pause the video and write down your thoughts on page 3 of your workbook. Resume the video when you're ready. Now that you've had a chance to reflect a little bit, let's move on to talking about conflict in the workplace. You'll be able to take what you learn here today and apply it to your situation and see how you might have handled the situation a little differently in order to ensure that the matter got resolved in a more satisfactory manner. Moving forward, you'll be able to use these techniques when you spot potential issues in the workplace. You'll be able to nip them in the bud before they become bigger problems. How would you define conflict? Before we talk about the dictionary definition of the term, think about how you think of conflict. You can write your thoughts on page 4 of your workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. In order to talk about conflict and its underlying causes, let's define what conflict is. Dictionary.com defines conflict as a fight, battle, or struggle, especially a prolonged struggle, strife, controversy, quarrel, a discord of action, feeling, or effect, antagonism or opposition, as of interests or principles, a conflict of ideas, a striking together, collision. Wow, those are all pretty dramatic. Now let's talk about conflict in the workplace. What do you think? Is conflict in the workplace a good thing or a bad thing? Or maybe both? If you feel like you want to take a moment to reflect on that, pause the video. There's space provided in your workbook on page 4 to capture your thoughts. Resume the video when you're ready. The dictionary definition of conflict really makes it sound like it's a bad thing, and even the word conflict itself typically has a negative connotation, but conflict doesn't always have to be negative. Here are some common misconceptions about conflict in the workplace. Conflict at work is unprofessional and should be avoided at all costs. All conflict is caused by a breakdown in communication, and all conflicts can be resolved so that everyone is happy. These are probably all things you've been told, either implicitly or explicitly, at some point in your career. These misconceptions are just that, misconceptions. In reality, as uncomfortable as it can be, conflict can actually be a source of growth and creativity. That's not to say that conflict is always a good thing. It's important to be able to recognize when conflict is a good thing and when it's detrimental. Let's go over some of the characteristics of good versus bad conflict. Characteristics of positive conflict are: it can cause people to consider different ideas, it can increase participation, and it can increase commitments to the decisions and goals of the team. Characteristics of negative conflict are: it can decrease morale, it can cause disrespect, it can cause high employee turnover, and it can become highly personal and emotional. Let's talk about a couple of scenarios that resulted in conflict and discuss what type of conflict it is. In the first scenario, Maria has been in her job for a few years. She always gets positive reviews and is eager to move up the career ladder. An opening arises on her team for someone to take the lead on a project. She thinks she's the perfect candidate, so when the role is given to someone else, without her even being consulted, she feels very hurt. She hadn't told anyone she was interested in the position, but she assumed her accomplishments were being seen and would be rewarded. Maria now feels a bit bitter and less engaged on her team. Would you classify the conflict that arose from that scenario as positive or negative, or both? You can write your thoughts on page 5 of the workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. In this case, the resulting conflict could be classified as negative. A lot of feeling and emotion was involved, but those hurt feelings could have been prevented. Had Maria expressed to leadership that she was interested in the position and made her case of why she was qualified, she may have gotten the position. Even if she didn't get the position, the situation may have turned out better because someone could have explained to her the reason why she didn't get it, and she would know what she needs to work on in order to maybe be considered more qualified next time. Here's another scenario for your consideration. A team needs to evaluate some proposals for projects. There are several viable proposals submitted, and the group meets to discuss them. The opinions at the table vary widely, and the conversation gets quite heated and lively at times, with different people advocating for different proposals. It takes several hours, but the group comes to a decision. The final decision was obviously not everyone's first choice, but everyone can live with it. What do you think? There was definite conflict here, with people disagreeing on the best way forward. Would you classify the conflict that happened here as positive or negative, or maybe both? Write your thoughts on page 6 of your workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. The conflict that happened in this situation could be classified as positive, although to be sure, we'd want a little more detail about the conversations that were taking place. As long as they were respectful and did not devolve into people insulting each other, there's absolutely nothing wrong with people having different opinions. When you have a diverse group of people debating something, it would actually be strange if everyone just agreed. In this case, the group was able to discuss with each other different ideas and why each one might be the winner, and an outcome resulted that everyone could live with. And notice, I didn't say everyone was happy with, because that might not be the goal or even be possible. But the solution was something that was not objectionable to anyone and that everyone could support. So, based on the two scenarios we just went through, you can see how conflict can be considered positive or negative, or healthy or unhealthy. Healthy conflict focuses on task issues. For example, there may be different opinions on how a task should be approached, whereas unhealthy conflict will be more about underlying issues. Let's see if you can solve a riddle. What is the word that even in plain sight remains hidden? You can write the answer on page 6 of your workbook. Pause the video if you need a moment to think about that. Again, what is the word that even in plain sight remains hidden? The answer is hidden. This is a fun way to demonstrate that just like the word hidden is in plain sight in this sentence, sometimes hidden conflict is really in plain sight if you know what to look for. In almost any workplace, it's going to be inevitable that there are some underlying issues going on, but if you become more aware of what to look for, they can be addressed. We can see that conflict in the workplace isn't always a bad thing, and if there's positive conflict that's happening, we don't really need to worry about that. What we do need to address is the negative conflict, and with negative conflict, things usually brew for a while under the surface before they come to light. When feelings and emotions are involved, people don't always want to bring something forth at work, maybe because they don't want to be seen as a troublemaker or as causing drama. But with this kind of conflict, it doesn't usually just evaporate. It often becomes worse if it's not addressed in some manner. According to VitalSmarts, a training and organizational development company, every unaddressed conflict wastes an average of 8 hours of organizational time. in the form of gossip or other unproductive activities. So it's really important to have some conflict management understanding and strategies. There are a few things that can cause the majority of negative conflict at work. The same root causes manifest themselves in different ways. Let's go over them. Poor communication. Examples of poor communication include inappropriate criticism, unclarified roles, or rules and policies that are not being clearly written. Silos are another underlying problem. In many large organizations, and NAVFAC is one, when there are many departments, what's known as silos can develop. When there is silo mentality, each department kind of gets in the groove of doing their own thing and isn't really aware of what the departments around them are doing. There's a reluctance to share information or expertise. Silo mentality can cause conflict in the form of poor communication, misunderstandings, duplication of efforts, and unwillingness to cooperate. Personal issues. Personal issues are also a source of underlying problems. Examples are emotional stress, personality differences, or if someone has personal issues going on outside the workplace but brings them to work, which is quite common. Work is such a big part of our lives, it's actually unrealistic to think that people can just check their emotions at the door. Lack of mission is another underlying problem. Are your people on the team for the right reason? When people don't have a clear sense of what the mission of their organization is, it can cause confusion and conflict. Similarly, mismanagement of organizational change or transition can cause conflict. If everyone is working towards different goals, that leaves the door open for issues. Lastly, disengagement can be an underlying problem. Employee disengagement can cause negative conflict in the workplace. This is when employees stop caring about the success of the organization and their own success within it. Some of the other problems we just talked about can lead to disengagement. The way disengagement manifests itself can be in the form of a lot of complaining or gossiping. It can also cause someone to not pull their weight at work, where the other people are then having to pick up the slack, which can be a huge source of conflict. Think about any negative conflict you've had at work and whether one of the underlying reasons on the previous slide was responsible. Are there any other underlying reasons for conflict you can think of that were not mentioned? Pause the video and write your thoughts on page 7 of your workbook. Resume the video when you're ready. One factor not mentioned specifically was cultural or generational issues. These could be considered a subset of personal issues. These types of issues can be a big contributor to conflict in the workplace. For example, consider that right now there are 4 generations of employees working together. You have Generation Z, Millennials, Gen Xers, and Baby Boomers all working together, with each generation having unique perspectives, experiences, and values. This can cause discord in the workplace. We've talked about how underlying issues can cause conflict, but how can we spot those issues since they're not always readily apparent? Here are some tips for that. The first tip is embrace the idea of conflict. This is a really tough one for many because it involves such a big shift in your thinking. If you're not someone who enjoys conflict, it may be hard to see that really good outcomes can result from conflict. If you're closed off to the idea that conflict can be positive, then you might have your blinders on and not see those underlying issues. So, put yourself in a little bit of discomfort and really observe what's going on around you. Another tip you can use is root cause analysis. Try to get to the bottom of something. It can help you find underlying conflict. You may want to meet with individual parties to get different perspectives on issues, and you want to ask non-judgmental, open-ended questions to really get people to open up and let you know what is going on. Questions that start with what or how rather than yes or no questions will give you better results. Also, stay away from questions starting with why. Even if you don't mean it that way, those questions can sometimes come across as judgmental and may do more harm than good when trying to get to the bottom of an issue. Active listening is another tip you can use. It's a technique for picking up on underlying issues. Active listening is a technique where you're not only listening to the words people are saying, but you're picking up on nonverbal cues as well and repeating back what you're hearing or observing to make sure you're understanding correctly. When you use that technique, You help articulate what the issues are. And lastly, knowing your style. There are different styles of dealing with conflict. Identifying your style will help you become more aware, and it will help you approach specific situations. Also, when you appreciate that there are different styles, it gives you a better understanding of why people behave differently and can make us more tolerant, thus actually reducing conflict. You may not know your conflict style or really have given much thought to that, so we are now going to go through a short quiz with you to help you determine that. I'm going to read you 3 questions. Each question has 5 possible choices. In your workbook, check the letter of the choice that most corresponds to how you see yourself handling the situation. Don't answer with what you think you should do. Answer with the option that feels most comfortable to you. Be honest with yourself. There are no right or wrong answers here. Question 1. When planning a retirement luncheon for a coworker, an argument ensues about the best venue for it. What do you do? A. Quietly slump down in your seat and hope no one asks your opinion. B. State your preference and try to persuade others. C. Offer suggestions that take everyone's preference into account. D. Go along with whatever is decided, regardless of whether you like it. Or E. Ask some more questions about everyone's preference and suggest something that everyone will be happy with. On page 7 of your workbook, check the box next to the letter that most corresponds to how you think you would handle this situation. There may not be a perfect choice here, but pick the one that is closest to how you would behave. Question 2. One of your coworkers approaches you and starts speaking very negatively about another coworker whom you also consider a friend. What do you do? A. Quickly exit the conversation. B. Defend your friend and let your coworker know that you find his behavior inappropriate. C. Admit to your coworker that your friend has some faults but still is a good worker. D. Listen and nod. And E. Get to the bottom of why your coworker feels this way and suggest some common ground. On page 8 of your workbook, check the box next to the letter that most corresponds to how you think you would handle the situation. Question 3. You are attending a critical work meeting where decisions that affect you and your job duties are being made. What do you do? A. Keep out of the conversation. You feel uncomfortable drawing attention to yourself. B. Use your knowledge on the subject to argue your position. C. Suggest an action that could be a middle ground position. D. Go along with whatever is decided, even if it unfairly puts more burden on you. Or E. See where everyone is coming from and find a solution that meets everyone's interests. On page 8 of your workbook, check the box next to the letter that most corresponds to how you think you would handle this situation. Now let's see where you are in your conflict management style. Look at the 3 letters you checked. Is there a letter you checked 2 or 3 times? That would be your preferred conflict management style. If you checked 3 different letters, that shows that you don't really have one preferred style and really feel comfortable using different approaches for different scenarios. Again, let me stress here that there is no right answer. Just because you tend to trend towards one style doesn't mean you have to always use that style either. It just means that that's the style you feel most comfortable with. If you checked mostly A, your preferred style is circumventing. If you checked mostly B, your preferred style is competing. If you checked mostly C, your preferred style is compromising. If you checked mostly D, your preferred style is conceding. And if you checked mostly E, your preferred style is collaborating. You may be wondering, what does my conflict style mean? These conflict styles were adapted from the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument and are summarized as the 5 C's. Let's go into a little more detail about each approach. If you checked mostly A's, your style is to circumvent. Here, you're avoiding the issue. So you know what the issue is, you've found the issue, but you're not doing anything about it. You might automatically think that this is never a good solution. Sticking your head in the sand typically has a negative connotation, but actually, this is not always a bad thing. It can be a good strategy when it doesn't really matter because it can buy you capital, you need to pick your battles, or when you have no chance of winning. Also, if you don't have the time to deal with an issue, or if you need more time to figure out how you feel about an issue, circumventing can be a good solution. If you checked mostly Bs, your preferred style is a competing style. This means taking a firm stance and being highly assertive, with little or no allowance for opposing viewpoints. This almost sounds like it has a negative connotation in the opposite direction of conceding. But again, we're not passing judgment here with any of these styles. All of them can be successful approaches. This is definitely a more stubborn approach, but it can be appropriate. For example, when you have to stand up for something ethical. Sometimes a competing style is necessary as a last resort when nothing else is working, or in an emergency situation when quick action needs to be taken. A little caveat here. If used inappropriately, competing style could result in more conflict and lead to misuse of power. It should be used sparingly. So even if this is your preferred approach, be aware that this is your style, and maybe try to rein it in a bit when it's not one of the types of situations we just discussed. You can definitely rub people the wrong way with this approach, so you don't want to overdo it. The next style is compromise. If you checked mostly Cs, your preferred style is compromise. Compromise is finding an acceptable solution that partially satisfies all parties. Right away, you have a more positive reaction when I say that word, right? And compromise can be a great thing. Again, we're not judging here or discounting the other styles. In the scenarios we talked about earlier, the scenario where the group came together to evaluate proposals and then picked one they could all live with was an example of compromising. Compromise can be a very effective conflict management style when you need a solution that's going to be at least minimally acceptable to all, or when you need a temporary solution to an important issue. Compromising style can be more time-consuming and requires some more people skills than the other techniques we've discussed up to this point. When you use a compromising style, it can make others feel like they are really being heard. And even though everyone's not getting exactly what they want, everyone can walk away with some sense of satisfaction. If you checked mostly D, your style is conceding. This means that you put others' concerns ahead of yours and are typically a peacekeeper. There are situations where this can be the preferred approach. For example, if during a conflict you realize you are wrong, and of course this will take a little self-reflection on your part, conceding may be a good option. If you realize the other party cares a lot more about the issue than you do, or they have more skin in the game, or when you want the workplace to be peaceful, conceding may be the right path. It's important to note, you should not concede if it goes against your morals or values. However, if the issue is something that in the grand scheme of things is not that important to you, sometimes it's better to give in. The last style is the collaborating style. If you picked mostly E's, this is your preferred style. It is often confused with compromise, but it's actually not the same thing. With compromise, everyone is satisfied, but not necessarily happy. Collaboration is the ultimate win-win approach. In theory, this may sound like the best approach because everyone walks away happy. The best way to collaborate is when all concerned parties state their interests rather than their positions. In other words, you want to figure out why everyone wants a certain outcome, not necessarily what the outcome is. To give you an example that really illustrates this, let's talk about the case of the orange. Two people are fighting over an orange. They both want the orange, so to compromise, they cut it in half. Sounds great, right? Well, not really, because one person wanted to make orange juice, and half an orange isn't really enough for that. The other person needed the rind to make a zest for cake, and a half orange isn't really enough for that. So if they had taken the time to discuss why they each wanted the orange, they could have collaborated and figured out that they could peel the orange. The person who's baking the cake could take all the peel, and the person who wanted to make juice could take all the flesh of the orange. This way, they truly each could have gotten enough of what they wanted, even though there was only one orange. Collaboration is almost always an appropriate approach, but it can be very time-consuming, so it may not always be the realistic option. We've now covered 5 different styles of conflict. From now on, when you spot an underlying issue, you can ask yourself, is my most preferred approach the best approach in this situation? Or maybe now that you're aware of the different conflict management styles, you can try to adapt your approach, even if it's a little bit out of your comfort zone. We've covered a lot of information here. I'd like you to just pause and reflect for a moment. Do you feel like your assessment was accurate? Why or why not? You may write your thoughts in the space provided on page 9 of your workbook. Pause the video and resume when you're ready. That concludes today's learning session. Today we discussed conflict as a positive or a negative, common underlying workplace issues and how to spot them, and conflict management styles. As we conclude this course, please ask yourself the following questions. Think about your current work environment. Are there underlying issues you may not have been aware of that you can see a bit more clearly now? Are they causing conflict? And will you address it? If so, how? Has your approach changed based on anything you learned today? You don't need to answer this right now, but take some time over the next few days to reflect on that. There is space in your workbook on page 10 if you'd like to write down any of those reflections there. Thank you all so much for attending today. Please email the Total Force Development account listed on your screen and in the workbook with any questions or comments, or contact your local Civilian Training Advocate, or BD17. You will receive credit for participating in this course. To receive credit, email the address below with the listed subject line, course name, and completion code. Please check the Career Compass Resource Center, or CCRC, often for updates and new content to support your learning. Again, thank you for your participation.